The wind didn't just blow through the broken streets of the neighborhood. It howled like it had something to say and no one left to listen. Winter had settled in hard that year, turning puddles into sheets of ice and breath into little clouds that vanished before they could warm anything. In the shadow of a half-collapsed apartment building, a girl crouched near a rusted dumpster, her fingers numb inside gloves that had long lost their lining. She wasn't looking for trash. She was looking for something to eat. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. That had been a slice of stale bread, shared with an old man who'd lost his glasses and couldn't tell day from night anymore. They'd split it without speaking. Words cost too much energy when your stomach feels like it's eating itself. The girl was 12, though she looked younger, her cheeks hollow, her eyes too big for her face. Her coat was 2 sizes too large, borrowed from someone who never came back. She didn't remember the exact day her home disappeared. It wasn't like in the movies with slow motion and dramatic music. One moment she'd been humming a tune while setting the table. The next, noise so loud it felt like her bones cracked. Then silence. Then smoke. Then nothing but rubble and the smell of burning wood and something worse. Something she couldn't name. Her parents were gone. Just like that. No goodbyes. No last hugs. Just empty space where they used to be. She'd stayed near the ruins for 3 days, calling out, digging with bare hands until they bled, hoping for a miracle. But miracles were in short supply that winter. Now, she moved like a ghost through the neighborhood, sleeping in empty shops or under stairwells, always careful to stay quiet, always watching for soldiers or looters. She'd learned to read footsteps. The heavy boots meant danger, the soft shuffles meant other survivors, maybe friends, maybe not. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But there was one thing she held on to, deep inside like a secret flame: music. Before everything fell apart, there'd been a neighbor, a kind woman with silver hair who played piano in the afternoons. The girl would sit on the floor by the window, listening, eyes closed, letting the notes wash over her like warm water. Sometimes the woman would let her press a few keys. "You've got good ears," she'd say, smiling. And gentle hands. The girl never took lessons. There wasn't money for that. But she remembered every melody, every rhythm. At night, when the cold bit hardest, she'd hum them under her breath or tap them out on her knees. Beethoven, Chopin, even simple folk songs her mother used to sing while cooking. Music was the only thing that made the fear quiet down, if only for a few minutes. Today, though, even the music in her head felt faint. Hunger had a way of drowning out everything else. Her legs shook as she stood up, brushing snow off her coat. She needed food. Not tomorrow. Now. She walked slowly down the street, past boarded-up windows and cars with flat tires. Most places were empty. But then she saw it. A small cafe tucked between a shuttered bookstore and a pharmacy with broken glass in the doorway. The cafe's windows were clean. There was light inside. And in the corner, right by the glass, sat a piano. Not a toy. A real one. Polished wood. Black and white keys gleaming under soft yellow light. Her breath caught. She hadn't seen a piano in months. Just the sight of it made her heart beat faster, like it remembered something her body had forgotten. She stood there for a long time, watching people come and go. They wore decent coats. They carried bags with bread and fruit. They laughed. They looked warm. She felt like a stranger from another world. But the piano called to her. What if? The thought came quietly, like a whisper she almost missed. What if she went in? What if she asked? She knew how she looked, dirty, thin, eyes wide with hunger. They'd probably shoo her away like a stray dog, maybe worse. But what did she have to lose? She was already at the edge. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. A bell jingled. Warm air rushed over her, carrying the smell of coffee, baked bread, and something sweet. Cinnamon, maybe. For a second, she forgot to be scared. It smelled like the world before people turned to look. Some frowned. Others glanced away quickly, as if pretending not to see her would make her disappear. She kept her eyes down, shuffling toward the counter where a man with a thick beard and tired eyes stood wiping a mug. He looked up. Yes, her throat felt dry. She swallowed. Her voice cracked. She tried again. Can I play for a chunk of food? Silence. Then a snort from a table near the window. A man in a wool hat chuckled. Play? You? Another woman smirked into her tea. Someone else muttered, "Look at her shoes." The girl didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just stood there waiting. The man behind the counter studied her. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't angry either. He looked curious. "You know how to play that piano?" he asked, nodding toward the corner. She nodded once. "Yes," he raised an eyebrow. "What would you play?" She didn't hesitate. "Chopin, the Nocturne." "In E-flat major?" That got a few more laughs. "Oh, sure," said the man in the wool hat. "Next she'll say she's Mozart's cousin." But the man behind the counter didn't laugh. He set the mug down. "All right," he said slowly. "Go ahead. But if you break a key, you're sweeping floors for a week." Relief washed over her so strong she almost stumbled. She walked to the piano, her boots squeaking on the wooden floor. Every eye followed her. She could feel their doubt like a weight on her shoulders. She sat on the bench. It was soft, real leather. She ran her fingers over the keys, cold at first, then warming under her touch. She closed her eyes and then she played. Not loud, not flashy, just pure, clear and full of feeling, like the music had been waiting inside her all this time, desperate to get out. The opening notes floated through the cafe like snow falling gently. Conversation stopped. Forks paused midair. Even the man in the wool hat sat back, his smirk gone. She didn't think about hunger. She didn't think about the cold or the rubble or the silence where her parents used to be. She just played. Every note precise, every phrase shaped with care, as if she were stitching her broken heart back together with sound. When the last note faded, no one moved. Then, someone clapped. Just once, then another. Then the whole room was applauding, not politely, but with real emotion. A woman wiped her eyes. The man behind the counter stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. He walked over slowly, holding a plate with a thick slice of rye bread, a piece of cheese, and a boiled egg. He set it on the piano lid. "Eat," he said, his voice rough, "and play again tomorrow if you want." She looked up at him, tears finally spilling over, not from sadness, not from hunger, but because for the first time in a long time someone had seen her, not as a beggar, not as a ghost, but as someone who mattered. She took the bread with trembling hands. It was warm. She took a bite. It tasted like hope. Outside, the wind still howled. But inside the cafe, for a few precious minutes, there was only music and the quiet beginning of something new. The morning after her first performance at the cafe, the girl woke before sunrise. Not because she was cold, though the back room still held a damp chill, but because her fingers wouldn't stop moving. Even in sleep, they tapped softly against the quilt, replaying the notes from the night before like they were afraid to forget. She sat up slowly, wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and listened. Outside, the city was quiet. No sirens, no shouting, just the soft hush of snow falling on broken pavement. She hadn't expected to stay. After eating that plate of bread and cheese, she thought she'd slip out before dawn, vanish back into the alleys like she always did. But the owner hadn't locked the back door, and when she peeked into the main room, she saw the piano waiting, its lid open, keys gleaming faintly in the streetlight. It felt like an invitation. She tiptoed to it, sat down, and played. Not for anyone, just for herself. A simple scale at first, then a melody her mother used to hum while stirring soup on the stove. The notes were soft, almost shy, as if testing whether they still belonged in the world. But with each phrase, her hands grew steadier. The music grew fuller. By the time the first streaks of light touched the windows, she was playing a piece she'd only heard once, on a crackling radio years ago, but remembered every turn, every pause, every breath between the notes. The cafe door creaked open. She stopped instantly, heart pounding, but it was just the owner, carrying a sack of flour over his shoulder. He froze when he saw her at the piano. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he set the flour down gently, as if afraid to break the silence, and walked to the counter without a word. Minutes later, he placed a steaming mug of weak tea and a thick slice of yesterday's bread on the table nearest the piano. "Play that again," he said quietly, not looking at her. She did, this time louder, clearer, and when she finished, he nodded once, just a small dip of his chin, and went back to kneading dough. That became their routine. She'd wake early, play while the city slept, then eat what he offered. By mid-morning, regulars started trickling in, not just for coffee, but to hear her. A woman who sold flowers at the market would bring a single carnation and leave it on the piano lid, An old man with a cane would sit in the same corner every day, eyes closed, tapping his foot in time. Even the stray cat that haunted the alley began curling up under the piano bench, as if the music kept it warm. But not everyone welcomed her. One afternoon, a group of teenagers swaggered in, loud and restless. They didn't order anything, just leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smirking as she played a gentle Schumann piece. "Look at her," one muttered. "Thinks she's famous now," another snorted. "Yeah, plays for bread like a circus monkey." Her fingers faltered for half a beat, but only half. She didn't stop, didn't look up. She let the music carry her past their words like a boat riding over rough water. When she finished, she stood slowly and walked to the counter for a glass of water. The boys watched her, waiting for her to flinch, to cry, to run. She didn't. Instead, she turned and said, voice calm but firm, "If you don't like the music, the door's right there." They blinked. One shuffled his feet. Another mumbled something under his breath. Then, one by one, they left, quieter than when they came in. After that, the owner started keeping a broom near the front door. Just in case, he'd say, though he never had to use it. Word spread. People came from other parts of the city just to hear her play. Some brought small gifts, a scarf, a bar of soap, a notebook with blank pages for writing music. Others just listened, eyes closed, faces softening like they'd forgotten how to feel something good. Then came the woman with the glasses. She arrived on a gray Tuesday, dressed in a long coat that looked too nice for the neighborhood. She didn't speak to anyone, just sat in the back sipping black coffee, watching the girl's hands as she played a piece she'd made up herself, something slow and searching, full of questions with no answers. When the song ended, the woman stood and walked over. "Have you ever had a teacher?" she asked. The girl shook her head. "No, just listening. Where did you learn that modulation in the second verse? The shift from minor to major?" The girl thought. It just felt right, like when the sun comes out after days of rain. The woman studied her for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small orange. "Eat this," she said, "and keep playing." She left without another word. But she came back the next day, and the next, always quiet, always watching. Sometimes she'd hum along under her breath, testing the girl's ear. Once she placed a sheet of music on the piano, just a few lines, and asked, "Can you read this?" The girl looked at the notes, then played it perfectly on the first try. The woman's eyes widened. "You've never seen written music before?" "Only pictures and books," the girl admitted. "But I can hear it in my head when I see the dots." That seemed to settle something in the woman's mind. A few days later, she returned with a young man carrying a small camera. "Would you mind if we record you?" she asked gently. "Just a short video, to share with people who care about music." The girl hesitated. Being seen felt dangerous. But the woman's eyes were kind. And the owner gave a small nod from behind the counter. So she played. The same Chopin nocturne from that first night, the one that had silenced the room. But this time there was no hunger in her hands, no desperation. Just pure, clear music flowing like a river that had finally found its path. When it was over, the woman wiped her eyes. The young man lowered the camera slowly, like he'd just witnessed something sacred. 2 days later, the video appeared online. No fancy title, no story, just on Piano in Kyiv, winter 2023. It started small, a few hundred views, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Comments flooded in. "Who is this child? This made me cry at work. Is she safe? Can someone help her?" A famous pianist in Paris shared it with his millions of followers. A music school in Vienna sent a message asking if she'd ever considered formal training. Back at the cafe, the owner printed out some of the kindest messages and taped them to the wall beside the piano. The girl read them over and over, still not believing they were about her. Then the letters began arriving. Handwritten notes from strangers in countries she'd only seen in old atlases. One came with a pair of gloves, soft wool lined with fleece, her size exactly. Another included a drawing from a little girl who wrote, "I want to play like you when I grow up." An elderly man in Canada sent a check with a note, "For lessons." Or bread or both. The owner didn't cash the check. He framed it instead and hung it behind the counter. But the most surprising thing wasn't the attention. It was the change inside her. She no longer played just to survive. She played because it was who she was. Because every note was a thread connecting her to a world that hadn't completely broken. Because when she played, she wasn't just a hungry girl in a ruined city. She was whole. Evenings became her favorite time. After the last customer left, after the owner wiped down the tables and turned off the main lights, she'd sit at the piano one more time. No audience. No expectations. Just her and the music, weaving hope into the quiet dark. And sometimes, when she played just right, she could almost hear her mother humming along from somewhere far away, proud, peaceful, and finally at rest. The video didn't just spread, it exploded. One morning, the girl woke to the cafe owner standing in the doorway of the back room, holding his phone like it might bite him. "You're everywhere," he said, voice low with disbelief. She sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and took the phone. On the screen was her own face, pale, focused, fingers moving over piano keys. Under a headline that read, "Unknown Child Prodigy Stuns World with Street Performance." She didn't understand at first. How could something so small, a 3-minute clip filmed on a rainy afternoon, cause such a stir? But as the days passed, the proof came in waves. First, reporters showed up outside the cafe, cameras slung over their shoulders, microphones in hand. They asked for interviews, for her story, for her name. She stayed inside, hiding behind the kitchen door while the owner politely turned them away. "She's just a kid," he'd say. Let her be. But the world wouldn't let go. Then came the messages, hundreds of them on every platform the owner didn't even know existed. People offered money, shelter, plane tickets, scholarships. A famous conductor in Vienna wrote a long letter saying he'd never heard such emotional depth in someone so young. A music foundation pledged to cover all costs for her education if she'd accept. Even government officials reached out, promising protection, support, a future. Amid all the noise, one message stood out. It came not through social media or email, but by old-fashioned post, a thick envelope with elegant handwriting and a return address from Austria. Inside was a letter written in careful English, signed by a woman who introduced herself as a retired concert pianist and former professor at a prestigious conservatory. She'd seen the video, she wrote, and couldn't stop thinking about it. "What I heard was not just talent," she said. "It was truth. And truth like that must be nurtured, not exploited." She didn't ask for anything. No interviews, no photos. Just a simple question. "Would you consider coming to Vienna? I can provide a safe place, real teachers, and time to grow. Not as a spectacle, but as a musician." The girl read the letter 3 times. Then she handed it to the cafe owner without a word. He read it slowly, his brow furrowed. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. This is real," he said. "This woman, she's known all over Europe. If she says you belong there, you do." "But what about here?" the girl asked quietly. "What about you?" He smiled a little sadly. "I'll be fine, but you've got something the world needs, and you deserve a chance to let it grow." Still, she hesitated. Leaving felt like betrayal, like turning her back on the rubble, on the memories, on the ghost of the life she'd lost. That night, she sat at the piano long after closing, playing not for anyone but for herself. She played the lullaby her mother used to sing. She played the Chopin piece that had changed everything. And then for the first time she played something new. A melody that started in sorrow but ended in light, like dawn breaking over ruins. The next morning, she told the owner, "I'll go." Arrangements moved faster than she expected. The woman from Vienna handled everything. Visas, travel permits, even a quiet escort through the border. There were no cameras at the train station, no crowds. Just the owner, holding a small suitcase he'd bought for her, and the woman with the glasses, the one who'd first recorded her, standing nearby with a thermos of tea and a wrapped sandwich. "You'll be okay," the owner said, his voice rough. He didn't hug her. Men like him didn't do that. But he pressed a small wooden music box into her hand, carved with tiny notes and a piano. "For when you miss home?" She nodded, throat too tight to speak. The journey was long, trains, buses, a quiet car ride through snow-dusted hills. She watched the landscape change from broken buildings to tidy villages, from gray skies to soft alpine peaks. Everything felt unreal, like she was dreaming. When she arrived in Vienna, the woman from the letter was waiting at the station. She wasn't what the girl expected. No fancy clothes, no air of importance. Just a kind face, silver hair pulled back neatly and eyes that seemed to see right through to her bones. "You're even younger than I imagined," the woman said softly, taking her suitcase, "and more tired." She didn't ask questions on the drive to the city. Just let the girl look out the window at the grand buildings, the horse-drawn carriages, the people walking with books and violins and lives that seemed untouched by war. Her new home was a small apartment above a quiet music school. Not luxurious, but warm. Clean sheets, a real bed, and in the corner of the living room, another piano. Not grand, but well cared for, its keys smooth and responsive. That first night she couldn't sleep. The silence was too perfect. No wind howling through cracks, no distant sirens. Just stillness. She got up and sat at the piano, playing softly so as not to wake anyone. The notes filled the room like old friends returning. The next morning, the woman made tea and toast and said, "Today, we listen." They went to the conservatory, a building older than her country, with marble floors and portraits of composers lining the halls. Students hurried past in formal clothes, carrying sheet music and instrument cases. The girl felt out of place in her second-hand coat and worn boots, but then the woman led her into a practice room and closed the door. "Play anything," she said. "Don't think, just feel." So she did. She played the piece she'd written in the cafe, the one that began in grief and ended in hope. Halfway through, the woman closed her eyes. When it was over, she didn't clap. She just said, "You hear music the way birds hear the sky. Naturally, completely." Over the next few weeks, the girl settled into a new rhythm. Mornings were for lessons, scales, theory, sight reading. Afternoons for practice. Evenings for quiet walks or listening to recordings of great pianists. She ate regular meals. She gained weight. Her hands, once chapped and raw, grew strong and supple. But it wasn't all easy. Sometimes in the middle of a lesson, a siren in the distance would send her heart racing. Once, during a thunderstorm, she hid under the piano until the woman found her and sat silently beside her until the shaking stopped. She didn't talk about her past. Not yet, but the woman never pushed. She just waited. And slowly the girl began to trust. One afternoon, the woman handed her a blank sheet of music paper. "Write something," she said. "Not what you think I want to hear. What you need to say." So she did. And what came out was raw, honest, full of loss and longing, but also resilience. The woman read it, then played it back exactly as written. When she finished, she turned to the girl and said, "This is your voice. Never be afraid of it." Months passed. The girl grew taller. Her playing grew deeper. She performed in small recitals at the school, then larger ones in city halls. Critics began writing about her, not as a war orphan turned prodigy, but as a serious young artist with rare emotional intelligence. But she never forgot where she came from. Every Sunday, she wrote a letter to the cafe owner, sometimes just a few lines, sometimes pages. She told him about the snow in Vienna, the taste of real chocolate, the way the piano sounded in an empty concert hall, and every time she ended with the same words, "Thank you for letting me play for a chunk of food." Back in the ruined neighborhood, the cafe stayed open, and on the wall beside the piano, the owner kept a small photo, printed from the internet, of the girl standing on a grand stage, bowing to a standing crowd. Beneath it, he'd written in chalk, "She started here." And every now and then, when the wind howled just right, he'd swear he could still hear her playing, soft, strong, and full of hope, carried all the way from a city far away. The first real test came on a cold March morning. 6 months after she'd arrived in Vienna, she'd been practicing for weeks, hours every day, fingers moving over the keys until they ached, mind replaying every phrase, every pause, every breath between notes. The piece was Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 14, The Moonlight, not the easiest, but the one that spoke to her most. It wasn't just music. It was a conversation between sorrow and stillness, and she'd lived both. The woman who'd brought her here, now more like a grandmother than a teacher, sat quietly in the corner of the practice room, listening. She didn't interrupt, didn't correct, just let the music unfold. When the final note faded, she stood and walked over. "You're ready," she said simply. "For what?" the girl asked, though she already knew. "For your first real concert, not a student recital. A proper one, in the small hall at the conservatory. Tickets sold. Critics invited." The girl's stomach dropped. She'd played for strangers before, back in the cafe, even in small school events. But this felt different. This wasn't just about playing well. It was about being seen. Truly seen. And that terrified her. What if I freeze? She whispered. What if I forget everything? The woman placed a hand on her shoulder. Then you'll remember why you play. Not for them, for you. And for everyone who's ever needed music to survive. The days leading up to the concert were a blur of rehearsals, fittings for a simple black dress, and quiet talks over tea. The woman never pushed. She just reminded her, you're not performing a miracle. You're sharing a truth. The night of the concert, the girl stood backstage, heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. Through the curtain, she could hear the murmur of the audience, soft, expectant. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought of the cafe, the snow, the smell of bread. The first time she touched those keys, half-starved and full of nothing but hope. Then she walked out. The stage lights were warm. The piano gleamed under them like it had been waiting just for her. She sat. The room fell silent and she played, not perfectly. There was a missed note in the second movement, just one, but she didn't stop. She let it pass like a crack in a window that still lets in light. Because what mattered wasn't perfection. It was honesty. And in that honesty, something extraordinary happened. People cried, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, wiping eyes, holding hands, breathing slower, as if the music had given them permission to feel something they'd locked away long ago. When she finished, the silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the room erupted, not just applause, but a standing ovation. Strangers hugged. An old man in the front row bowed his head and stayed that way for a full minute. Backstage, the woman was waiting, eyes shining. She didn't say, I told you so. She just opened her arms, and for the first time since arriving in Vienna, the girl let herself be held. The next morning, reviews appeared in newspapers and online. Headlines called her a voice from the ruins, a miracle in minor keys, the most emotionally honest young pianist in a generation. But what moved her most wasn't the praise. It was the letters. A teacher from a refugee camp in Poland wrote, I showed your video to my students. One boy, who hasn't spoken since his home was bombed, sat at our broken keyboard yesterday and played 3 notes. He smiled. Thank you. A nurse in a hospital wrote, I played your Moonlight recording for a patient in hospice. She held her daughter's hand and passed peacefully. Your music gave her peace. Even the cafe owner sent a short note. They're talking about you here like you're a legend. But I still see the girl who asked for bread. Proud of you, always. But with the attention came pressure. Agents started calling. Record labels offered contracts. A famous orchestra invited her to perform as a soloist. Everyone wanted a piece of her, her story, her image, her sound. One producer even suggested she wear a tattered coat on stage to remind people where you came from. The woman shut that down fast. She's not a symbol, she told them firmly. She's a musician, and we will not turn her pain into a costume. The girl appreciated that more than she could say, because the truth was she didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to play, to grow, to heal. And healing, she was learning, wasn't a straight line. Some nights she still woke up gasping, dreaming of smoke and silence. Some days the weight of all those expectations made her want to hide under the piano again. But now she had tools. She had someone who listened without judgment. She had music that could carry her through the darkest hours. One afternoon, while walking through the city, she passed a small community center. Through the window she saw children, some with crutches, some with tired eyes, some speaking languages she didn't know, sitting around a battered upright piano. A volunteer was trying to teach them a simple scale, but the keys stuck and the kids were losing interest. Without thinking, she stepped inside. May I? She asked softly. The volunteer nodded, surprised. She sat. Not as a star. Not as a prodigy. Just as someone who remembered what it felt like to need music more than food. She played a short, cheerful tune, something easy to follow, full of bounce and light. Then she showed them how to find middle C, how to press a key without fear, how to make a sound that was theirs alone. One little girl, no older than 5, reached out and pressed a key. Then another. Soon they were laughing, taking turns, making up silly songs. When the girl left, the volunteer whispered, You just gave them hope. No, she said gently. I just reminded them they already had it. That moment stayed with her. It sparked an idea, one she brought to the woman over dinner that night. "What if," she said slowly, "we could help kids like me? Not just teach piano, but give them a place to feel safe. To be heard?" The woman smiled. "I've been waiting for you to say that." Together they began planning. Not a big foundation, not a flashy campaign, just a quiet project. A music room in a refugee center with donated instruments, volunteer teachers, and open doors. The girl would help design it. Maybe even visit when she could. It wouldn't fix the world, but it might fix a few hearts. As spring arrived in Vienna, the girl stood one evening on the balcony of her apartment, listening to the city hum below. She thought about how far she'd come, from rubble to recital halls, from begging for bread to being asked to play for presidents and poets. But none of that changed who she was at her core. A girl who loved music because it saved her when nothing else could. And now, she wanted to pass that lifeline on. She went back inside, sat at the piano, and began composing a new piece. This one wasn't about loss. It was about hands reaching out, about broken things made beautiful again, about the quiet courage it takes to ask, "Can I play for a chunk of food?" And the even greater courage it takes to say yes. Outside, the first stars appeared in the sky. And somewhere in a cafe far away, a new child might be listening, waiting for their turn to play. Life in Vienna settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, if ordinary could include daily piano lessons, quiet walks through cobblestone streets, and the soft clink of teacups during late-night talks about Chopin's phrasing, or the way silence between notes could speak louder than sound. The girl no longer startled at loud noises. She slept through the night more often than not. Her hands, once raw and trembling, now moved with confidence over the keys, strong and sure. But ordinary didn't mean easy. Every morning, she still woke with a quiet question in her chest. Do I belong here? The conservatory was full of students who'd been playing since they could walk, whose parents were musicians or professors, who spoke 3 languages and never worried where their next meal would come from. She didn't resent them, but sometimes in the hallway between classes, she'd catch a glance, curious, maybe even skeptical, and feel like an imposter wearing borrowed shoes. The woman who'd taken her in never let that doubt take root for long. One rainy afternoon, after a particularly tough lesson where the girl had stumbled through a complex Liszt piece, she sat at the piano in their apartment, head in her hands. "I'll never be as good as them," she muttered. The woman set down her knitting and walked over. "Good at what? Playing fast? Hitting every note? That's not music. That's mechanics." She sat beside her on the bench. "You know what they can't teach in any conservatory? The thing you already have." The girl shook her head. "The ability to make someone feel less alone. That's your gift. Not your fingers. Your heart." It was that heart that led her to say yes when the conservatory asked her to perform at a charity gala for displaced children. The event was held in a grand hall with crystal chandeliers and velvet seats. But the audience wasn't made up of critics or wealthy patrons. It was filled with families who'd fled war just like she had, some still wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, eyes still holding that familiar mix of exhaustion and hope. She didn't play Liszt that night. She didn't play anything flashy. She played the simple folk tune her mother used to hum. She played the melody she'd made up in the cafe, the one that sounded like snow falling on broken glass. And she played a new piece, gentle, questioning, but ending with a quiet lift like a hand reaching out in the dark. Afterward, a little boy, no older than 7, walked up to her backstage. He didn't speak, just held out a drawing, a girl at a piano surrounded by musical notes that turned into birds flying toward the sun. She knelt and took it. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once and ran back to his mother, who mouthed, "Thank you," through tears. That night, something shifted inside her. She realized she didn't have to choose between being a student and being a voice for others. She could be both. With the woman's help, she began visiting community centers and refugee shelters around the city. Not as a performer, but as a listener. She'd sit with kids, ask what sounds made them happy, a bird, rain on a roof, a lullaby, and help them turn those sounds into simple melodies. Sometimes they'd just press keys together, laughing when they made a funny noise, Other times, a teenager would play a few hesitant notes and whisper, "This is the song my grandma used to sing." Those moments meant more to her than any standing ovation. Back at the conservatory, her teachers noticed a change. Her playing grew deeper, more nuanced. She wasn't just interpreting the music, she was living it. During a master class on Schubert, when asked to describe the emotion behind a particular phrase, she said quietly, "It's the feeling of remembering someone you love and realizing they're still with you, just in a different way." The room fell silent. Even the professor blinked back tears. Her progress didn't go unnoticed beyond Vienna. An invitation arrived from New York, a chance to perform at a small but respected concert series known for showcasing young, authentic voices, not a huge stage. No flashing lights, just a historic hall, a fine piano, and an audience that truly listened. The woman hesitated. "It's a big step," she said. "Are you ready?" The girl thought about it for a long time. She remembered the cafe, the hunger, the fear of being laughed at. Then she remembered the boy with the drawing, the woman who cried at the refugee center, the way music had stitched her back together, one note at a time. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." The trip was quiet, respectful. No media circus. Just a small team from the concert series who treated her like a musician, not a story. When she arrived in New York, the city felt overwhelming at first. So loud, so fast, so full of people rushing in every direction. But the moment she stepped into the rehearsal hall and touched the piano, everything slowed down. She practiced for 2 days, adjusting to the instrument, the acoustics, the energy of the space. On the night of the concert, she wore the same simple black dress from her Vienna debut. No fancy gown, no jewelry, just her, the piano, and the music. The hall wasn't full, only about 100 people, but every seat was taken. She played a program that mixed classical pieces with her own compositions. Halfway through, during a quiet passage of her original work, a baby in the audience cooed softly. Instead of pausing, she smiled and let the note hang as if welcoming the sound into the music. Afterward, people lingered. Not for autographs, but for conversation. A man told her he'd lost his home in a hurricane and hadn't cried in years. Until tonight. A young pianist asked how she stayed so calm under pressure. She just said, "I don't play for them. I play for the part of me that needed to hear it." The next morning, a short review appeared in a respected arts blog. Not a prodigy on display, but a soul in conversation. Rare, real, necessary. When she returned to Vienna, she didn't feel like a different person, but she felt more sure of who she was. That summer, she helped open the first music room in a refugee support center on the city's edge. It wasn't fancy, just a few donated keyboards, a guitar with missing strings, a drum, and a shelf of beginner sheet music. But the walls were painted with musical notes and suns and hands holding each other. On opening day, she sat at the piano and played a short welcome song. Then she invited the children to join her. One by one they did, pressing keys, tapping rhythms, humming tunes from homelands they might never see again. As she watched a little girl giggle while playing a wobbly scale, the girl who once asked for bread felt something settle deep inside her chest. This wasn't fame. This wasn't success in the way the world measured it. But it was purpose. And for the first time since the bombs fell, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because she'd escaped the rubble, but because she'd carried its lessons into the light. Later that evening, she sat alone in the music room after everyone had left. The sun streamed through the window, casting golden squares on the floor. She placed her hands on the keys and played softly, not for an audience, not for a cause, just for herself. And in that quiet room, filled with the ghosts of old pain and the seeds of new hope, the music flowed like a river finally reaching the sea. Even with warm meals, clean sheets, and a piano that never missed a note, the past didn't just disappear. It lived in her bones. Some days it stayed quiet, tucked away like an old coat in the back of a closet. But other days it rose without warning, sharp and sudden, like a splinter working its way to the surface. It happened most often at night. She'd be asleep, dreaming of snow falling gently on cobblestone streets, and then without warning the dream would shift. The snow would turn to ash. The quiet would shatter into noise so loud it felt like her ribs cracked. She'd wake gasping, drenched in sweat, heart hammering like it was trying to escape. The room would be dark, safe, full of soft shadows and the faint hum of the city outside. But her body wouldn't believe it. Her hands would shake. Her breath would come too fast. And for a few terrifying minutes she'd be back in the rubble, calling out into silence that never answered. The woman who'd taken her in never rushed in when this happened. She'd wait, sometimes just outside the door, sometimes sitting quietly in the hallway with a cup of tea, giving space but making sure she wasn't alone. Only when the girl's breathing slowed would she knock softly and ask, "Would you like some company?" They never talked about the dreams directly, not at first. Instead, they'd sit in the kitchen, wrapped in blankets, sipping warm milk with honey, and talk about small things. The stubbornness of old pianos, the way Viennese bread crusts cracked just right, the sound of rain on the roof. It was in those quiet moments that the girl began to feel safe enough to speak. One evening after a particularly bad night, she finally said it out loud. "I keep hearing them call my name. But when I turn, there's no one." The woman didn't offer empty comfort, didn't say it's okay or you're safe now, even though both were true. Instead, she said, "Grief doesn't leave because you found a new home. It just learns to live beside you." She suggested something gentle, not a therapist with a clipboard and stiff questions, but a quiet woman who played the cello and spoke in soft tones. "She doesn't fix people," the woman explained. "She helps them listen to themselves." At first, the girl resisted. Talking felt like opening a wound. But after another sleepless week, she agreed. The sessions weren't what she expected. No probing questions about the day her world ended. No pressure to move on. Just a calm room, 2 chairs, and a woman who asked, "What does your body feel when you play that piece in C minor?" Slowly, the girl began to connect the music to the memories. She realized that the reason she always rushed through the loud parts of Beethoven was because loud sounds still made her flinch. That she avoided certain keys because they reminded her of the tone of a siren. That she played sad pieces beautifully, but rarely allowed herself joy in music as if happiness were a betrayal of what she'd lost. "Music isn't just expression," the cello player said one day. "It's also healing. But only if you let it hold all of you, not just the strong parts." That idea changed everything. Back at the piano, she started experimenting. She played fast pieces just to feel the thrill of speed, not to prove anything. She played cheerful folk tunes even if her fingers felt clumsy. She let herself laugh when she hit a wrong note instead of freezing in shame. And for the first time, she began writing music that wasn't about loss but about small moments of light. The smell of fresh bread, the sound of children laughing in the courtyard, the way the woman hummed while watering her plants. One afternoon, while practicing a new composition, she noticed something strange. Her hands weren't tense. Her shoulders weren't hunched. She was smiling. She stopped playing and just sat there surprised. The woman walked in with a tray of tea and saw her expression. "What is it? I forgot to be afraid," the girl said almost in wonder. "That's not forgetting," the woman replied, setting down the tray. "That's healing." But healing wasn't a straight path. There were still hard days. Once, during a rehearsal for a small concert, a delivery truck backfired loudly outside the hall. The sound was so close to an explosion that she dropped her sheet music and ducked behind the piano, trembling. The other musicians froze. No one spoke. One of them quietly closed the windows. Another turned off the bright stage lights. And the conductor, a kind man with silver hair, simply sat on the floor beside her and waited. When she finally looked up, he didn't say a word about the performance. He just asked, "Would you like to try again tomorrow?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face, not from fear but from relief. Someone had seen her break and hadn't looked away. After that, the conservatory made small changes. They gave her a quiet room to warm up before performances. They warned her before any loud stage effects. They treated her not as fragile but as human, someone carrying invisible weight but still strong enough to carry it. And she was. She began speaking more openly, not in interviews but in small settings. At a gathering for young musicians, she shared how music helped her survive when words failed. At a school visit, she told students, "It's okay if your hands shake, just let the music hold them." Her honesty gave others permission to be honest too. A boy in one of the refugee music rooms confessed he hadn't spoken to his teacher in months because he was ashamed of his accent. After hearing her story, he played a short melody he'd written and said, "This is my voice." "Even if it's not perfect," she nodded. That's the only kind that matters. As the months passed, the nightmares grew fewer. She still dreamed of her parents sometimes, but now in the dreams they were smiling. They'd sit at the piano with her, their hands over hers, guiding her through a song she'd never heard but somehow knew by heart. When she woke, she didn't feel empty. She felt loved. One spring morning, she sat at the piano and played a new piece from start to finish without stopping. It began with a single, lonely note like a question in the dark. Then slowly other notes joined in, weaving together into something warm, steady, and full of hope. When she finished, the woman who'd been quietly knitting in the corner looked up with tears in her eyes. "What's it called?" she asked. The girl thought for a moment. Then she smiled. Still here. And she was, not just surviving, not just playing, but living fully, tenderly, courageously, with all her scars and all her songs. The past hadn't vanished, but it no longer owned her. Now she owned her story, and she was ready to share it, not as a warning, but as a light for others walking through their own dark. The invitation came in a plain white envelope. No logo, no fanfare, just a handwritten note on thick paper. It asked if she would consider performing at a major concert hall in New York, not as a student, not as a curiosity, but as a featured artist. The program was part of a global series highlighting young musicians whose work carried a message beyond the notes. The catch? She would need to speak briefly before playing, just a few words about why music mattered to her. At first, she said no, not because she was afraid of the stage. She'd played in front of hundreds by now, but because speaking felt different. Playing let her hide inside the music. Talking meant stepping out into the open, raw and real with no piano to shield her. But the woman who'd become her anchor didn't push. She just left the letter on the kitchen table and said, "Think about who might need to hear your voice, not just your hands." That night, the girl lay awake, not from nightmares, but from memory. She thought of the boy in the refugee center who'd drawn her as a bird. She thought of the old man in the cafe who'd stopped talking after the war, but hummed along when she played. She thought of all the children who'd touched a piano for the first time, because someone believed they deserved to make beauty, even if their world was broken. By morning, she'd changed her mind. "Yes," she told the woman over breakfast, "I'll do it." Preparation wasn't just about the music this time. It was about finding the right words, simple, honest, not polished like a speech, but true like a conversation. She practiced in front of the mirror, then in front of the woman, then in an empty hall. Each time she stumbled at first, voice shaky, eyes down. But slowly she found her rhythm, not as a performer, but as a person who'd been through something and wanted to help others feel less alone. The night before she left for New York, she visited the music room she'd helped start in Vienna. Children were still there, laughing, arguing over who got to play next, making joyful noise on slightly out-of-tune keyboards. She sat with them for a while, not as a star, just as someone who remembered what it felt like to need a safe place. One little girl tugged her sleeve. "Will you play for us before you go?" She did. A short, bright tune full of hops and skips, something that sounded like hope with its shoes untied. When she finished, the kids clapped wildly, not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs. At the airport the next day, the woman handed her a small notebook. "Write down how you feel," she said. "Not for anyone else. Just for you." New York was louder, faster, brighter than Vienna, but this time she didn't feel lost in it. She walked through the city with her head up, noticing the street musicians, the kids dancing to buskers, the old man playing chess in the park with a tiny radio playing classical music beside him. Music was everywhere, not just in concert halls, but in the cracks of everyday life. Backstage at the hall, she wasn't nervous. She was calm. She ran her fingers over the grand piano, smooth, responsive, waiting. She took a deep breath and stepped out. The hall was full. Not packed like a pop concert, but deeply present. People leaning forward, eyes soft, ready to listen. She stood at the microphone for a moment, silent. Then she spoke, voice quiet but clear. "I used to play for food. Just a chunk of bread, a slice of cheese." People laughed. They didn't know I'd lost everything. My home, my family, my voice. But the piano, it gave me a new one. Not to replace what I lost, but to carry it forward. She paused. Music didn't fix my pain, but it held it. And that made all the difference. Then she sat and played. Her program began with a piece by Chopin, familiar, elegant, but she played it like a lullaby for the broken. Then came one of her own compositions, Still Here, the one she'd written after the nightmares began to fade. It started with a single searching note, then slowly gathered strength, weaving in rhythms that sounded like footsteps returning home, like hands reaching through the dark. Halfway through, she glanced up and saw a woman in the front row wiping her eyes. Behind her, a teenager nodded slowly, as if recognizing a feeling he couldn't name. In the balcony, a man held his daughter's hand tightly. When she finished, the silence was deep. Then came the applause, not loud but full of heart. People stood not out of habit but out of respect. Afterward, she didn't rush off stage. She stayed to talk. A teacher asked if she'd consider working with students in underserved schools. A doctor said she played music for her patients in hospice and wanted to share the girls' recordings. A young refugee, now studying music herself, whispered, "You made me believe I could belong here too." That night, back in her hotel room, she opened the notebook the woman had given her. On the first page, she wrote, "They didn't just hear me, they saw me." The next morning, an email arrived from a global children's organization. They'd seen the performance online. Someone had filmed it from the audience and posted it with her permission. The video had already been shared thousands of times. The organization asked if she'd be willing to partner with them to bring music programs to refugee camps and war-affected communities around the world. She showed the email to the woman over a video call. "What do you think?" The woman smiled. "I think you already know the answer." So she said yes. Not as a spokesperson, not as a face on a poster, but as a guide. She helped design simple, portable music kits, small keyboards, rhythm instruments, songbooks with universal melodies. She recorded short teaching videos in multiple languages, and whenever her schedule allowed, she visited the programs in person. In a camp on the edge of a dusty plain, she sat cross-legged on the ground with a group of children who'd never seen a piano. She showed them how to make rhythms with sticks and buckets. She sang simple songs that needed no translation. One boy, who hadn't spoken since fleeing his village, tapped a steady beat on a tin can for 10 full minutes, his first act of expression in months. In a city still rebuilding after conflict, she met teenagers who'd turned to music to stay off the streets. She listened to their rough compositions full of anger and hope and told them, "Your truth matters. Keep writing it." Back home, she used part of her performance fees to expand the music room in Vienna, then another in Berlin, then one in a community center near where she'd once slept in the cold. Reporters wanted to call her a hero. She always corrected them. "I'm not a hero," she'd say. "I'm someone who was given a chance. Now I'm trying to pass it on." Her concerts grew, but never at the cost of her purpose. She turned down flashy offers that wanted her story without her voice. She refused to be packaged as a tragic prodigy. Instead, she insisted that every program she joined include a community outreach component. Free lessons, open rehearsals, time with kids who'd never set foot in a concert hall, and always, she played with the same honesty that had silenced a cafe years ago. One evening after a performance in London, a young girl waited by the stage door, clutching a handmade card. Inside she'd written, "You made me want to be brave. Thank you for playing." The girl, now no longer just the girl from the cafe, knelt and hugged her. "Keep playing," she whispered, "even if it's just for yourself." That night she called the woman back in Vienna. "It's working," she said, voice thick with emotion. "The music, it's reaching them." "It always will," the woman replied, "because it's not really about you. It's about the space you create for others to heal." And that, more than any standing ovation or headline, was the real success. She wasn't just a pianist anymore. She was a bridge between pain and peace, between silence and song, between one lost child and the next who might still be found. And every time she sat at the piano, she played not just for those listening, but for the child she once was, starving, shivering, daring to ask, "Can I play for a chunk of food?" Now the answer echoed in every note. Yes. Always yes. Years had passed since the war ended, but the city still carried its scars, like old tattoos on skin that had learned to live again. Buildings stood rebuilt, but some windows stayed boarded. Streets were clean, but certain corners held silence that no one dared to fill. And yet life had returned. Children played in courtyards. Vendors sold bread and flowers. Music drifted from open windows. She stepped off the train with a small suitcase and a coat that fit her perfectly now, no longer borrowed, no longer too big. The air smelled different than Vienna, sharper, earthier, laced with the scent of wet stone and distant rain. Her heart beat faster, not from fear but from something deeper, like coming home to a place that had once broken you, only to find it waiting with open arms. She didn't go to the old neighborhood right away. She walked through the city first, taking it in slowly. The bookstore that had been rubble was now a cafe with potted plants. The pharmacy had new glass and a bright red awning. And then there it was, the little cafe on the corner between the bookstore and the pharmacy, just as she remembered it. Only now the sign above the door read, Melody Corner, Music and Coffee. She paused outside, breath catching. The windows were clean. Warm light glowed inside, and in the same spot by the glass the piano sat, polished, loved, waiting. She pushed the door open. A bell jingled. The smell hit her instantly. Coffee, cinnamon, fresh bread, the same scent that had felt like a miracle all those years ago. The place was fuller now, with mismatched chairs, shelves of sheet music, and a chalkboard listing daily specials alongside beginner piano lesson times. Behind the counter stood the same man, older now, his beard more gray than black, but his eyes just as kind. He looked up and froze. For a long moment neither moved. Then his face softened, and he wiped his hands on his apron like he was making sure he was real. "You came back," he said, voice rough. She nodded. "I did." He didn't ask how she was. Didn't mention the concerts, the headlines, the world tours. He just walked around the counter, pulled out a chair by the piano and said, "Play something." She sat. The bench was the same, worn smooth by time and countless hands. She placed her fingers on the keys. They felt familiar, like old friends, but this time she didn't play Chopin. She didn't play Beethoven. She played a piece she'd written herself, a composition called For a Chunk of Bread. It began with a single, hesitant note, the sound of a child asking for help. Then it grew, weaving in the rhythm of footsteps on snow, the warmth of bread shared in silence, the laughter that came after tears, the quiet courage it takes to believe you deserve to be heard. People stopped talking. A mother hushed her child. A young man setting up music stands near the door froze, bow in hand. Even the coffee machine seemed to pause. When the last note faded, the room stayed still. Then slowly the cafe owner walked over with a plate. Rye bread, cheese, a boiled egg, just like the first time. He set it on the piano lid and said, "Eat." She smiled through tears and took a bite. It tasted like memory, like gratitude, like home. Afterward, she walked outside. A small crowd had gathered, not reporters, not fans, but neighbors. And among them, a line of children holding notebooks and second-hand violins and eyes full of curiosity. One of them stepped forward, a girl no older than she'd been that first day. "Are you the one who played here before?" She asked shyly. "I am," she said. "My teacher says you built a music school," the girl said, clutching a worn-out keyboard bag. Can I learn there?" She knelt so they were eye to eye. "You don't have to go far," she said gently. "The school is right here," because that's what she'd done. Not just funded it, built it. Right next door to the cafe, in a building that had once been empty for years. Now it had practice rooms, a small concert space, shelves of donated instruments, and a sign that read, "All are welcome." No one turned away. She'd insisted on it. No auditions, no fees. Just open doors and open hearts. That afternoon, she gave her first lesson in the new school. Not as a world-famous pianist, but as someone who remembered what it felt like to need a chance. She showed the children how to find middle C, how to press a key without fear, how to listen, not just to the notes, but to the feelings behind them. Later, as the sun dipped low, she returned to the cafe. The owner handed her a cup of tea. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the street fill with golden light. "You know," he said after a while, "people still talk about that night, the first time you played. Some say it changed this whole block." She looked around, at the music school, the kids laughing outside, the piano glowing in the window. "It changed me too," she said softly. He nodded. "Funny, isn't it? You came in asking for a chunk of food, and ended up feeding so many." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked back to the piano, sat down and played a short, quiet tune. Just for him. A melody full of thanks, full of peace, full of the kind of joy that only comes after you've walked through fire and found your way out. Outside, the children gathered again, not to stare, but to listen. Some sat on the steps. Others peeked through the window. One little boy started tapping the rhythm on his knee, and in that moment the circle closed. The laughter that had once mocked her, "Can I play for a chunk of food?" was long gone, replaced by something far more powerful, belief. Not just in her, but in every child who dared to dream, even when the world felt broken. She played until the streetlights came on. Then she stood, kissed the cafe owner on the cheek, and walked next door to the music school, where a dozen young hands waited to learn how to make beauty from silence. The war had taken much, but it hadn't taken her music. And now that music was giving others what she'd once needed most, a place to belong, a voice to be heard, and the quiet certainty that even in the hardest times, someone might just say yes, and that, more than any concert hall or headline, was the real masterpiece.